They said Duke Cale Draven was a man who never flinched. They said his eyes could strip a general of his rank before the sentence finished leaving his mouth. They said his silence was worse than any verdict. But nobody warned Seraphine Vale what it would feel like to stand outside a locked door on her wedding night, hearing laughter that wasn't hers, wearing a gown that cost more than a village's harvest, understanding in one cold, absolute moment that she had been married and discarded in the same hour. Stay until the end. What she does next will change everything. Disclaimer. This is a work of fiction created entirely for entertainment purposes. All characters, events, and settings are imaginary. Any resemblance to real persons or real events is purely coincidental. My mom. The candles in the east corridor had burned down to their copper holders by the time Seraphine Vale understood that her husband was not coming. She had known it, somewhere in the architecture of her body, since the ceremony ended. Since the moment Kyle Draven had placed the ducal ring on her finger without looking at her face, his jaw angled away, his attention pulled toward some private calculation she wasn't invited to witness. The assembled court had seen the gesture. The older women in the gallery had exchanged glances the way older women always did at imperial marriages. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of sad, practiced recognition. Seraphine had felt those glances the way you feel weather changing before the clouds arrive. But knowing and understanding were two separate countries, and she had spent the entirety of her wedding banquet traveling the distance between them. The bridal chamber of Draven Keep occupied the entire northeastern corner of the third floor, its windows overlooking the courtyard where torches still burned in iron brackets and where, below, the last of the wedding guests were being guided to their quarters by footmen in the Draven colors of black and deep crimson. Seraphine could hear the murmur of voices drifting up from the courtyard. Laughter. The clink of a glass somewhere. The ordinary sounds of a celebration winding itself down into the comfortable dark. She stood in the corridor outside the chamber door in her wedding gown, the ivory silk so heavy at the hem that it had collected dust from 3 different rooms, and she listened. Inside she could hear voices. One of them was Kyle's. Low, unhurried, with that particular quality of ease she had never heard him direct at her. Not during the 6 weeks of formal courtship, not during the contract negotiations she'd been permitted to observe from the corner of a room, not once during the ceremony itself. The other voice was a woman's, higher, punctuated by soft, deliberate laughter. Seraphine stood very still. She had been raised in a political household. Her father, Lord Hadrian Vale of the Northern Province, had groomed her from childhood for exactly this kind of arrangement, had taught her to read power the way other fathers taught their daughters to read music. She understood that marriages like hers were instruments, not experiences. She understood that affection was not a term in the contract, and that comfort was not guaranteed. She had accepted all of this with the measured clarity of a woman who had learned early that acceptance and defeat were not the same thing. But she had not, somewhere in the careful architecture of her preparation, fully accounted for the specific quality of this humiliation. The door was locked. She had tried it once, a few minutes ago, quietly, the way you test ice before committing your weight to it. The handle had not moved. She had not tried again. Now she stood with her back against the opposite wall of the corridor and looked at the door and tried to locate the version of herself that was supposed to know what to do next. A footman appeared at the far end of the corridor, registered her presence, and stopped walking. His face went carefully neutral. He bowed with precise formality and began backing away, which told her everything she needed to know about how visible she was and how long she had been standing here. The entire keep knew. Possibly they had known before she did. She thought about her father, about the letter he had sent 3 weeks ago when the marriage agreement was finalized, sealed with the Vale crest, written in his careful hand. He had said the Draven alliance would secure the province's eastern borders for a generation. He had said Kyle Draven was a complicated man who required patience and handling, which had been the most honest thing her father had ever written about another person. He had not said anything about locked doors. Seraphine pushed herself off the wall. She walked to the door of the bridal chamber and raised her hand and knocked twice, not frantically, not apologetically, the way you knock when you own the house. The voices inside went quiet. A long pause, long enough to be intentional, long enough to be a sentence. Then Kyle's voice, through the wood, "Not now." 2 words, flat, dismissive, the tone of a man speaking to a servant who had interrupted something important. Something shifted in Seraphine's chest. Not breaking. She had nothing left to break at this particular moment. More like a mechanism releasing, a lock disengaging from the inside. "Understood," she said, to the door, to the corridor, to no one in particular. She turned and walked away from the chamber. She walked past the footman, who pressed himself against the wall and did not meet her eyes. She walked past the gallery of oil portraits, 6 generations of Draven dukes looking down from their gilded frames with expressions of absolute certainty, as if the act of being portrayed had confirmed something they had always suspected about their own importance. She walked past the grand staircase where 2 more members of the household staff were pretending to be occupied with tasks that had not existed 30 seconds ago. She walked through the main hall, where the last few wedding guests still lingered near the fire, wine glasses in hand, and she felt the silence fall over them as she passed through. That specific collective silence that is not absence of sound, but the sudden suppression of it, the held breath of a room full of people who have just witnessed something they will spend the next decade describing to their friends. She walked out the front entrance of Draven Keep. The night air hit her like cold water, and she stopped at the top of the stone steps and breathed it in. The courtyard below was nearly empty now. 4 or 5 carriages still waited near the gate, their drivers huddled in conversation or half asleep on their boxes. Torchlight pooled on the cobblestones. Her breath rose and disappeared in small white plumes against the dark. She was still wearing her wedding gown. She had no coat. She had no plan. At the edge of the courtyard nearest the gate, one carriage was still fully lit, lanterns on both sides of the door burning bright, the horses alert and unhitched from their feeding bags, the driver sitting upright on his box with the particular watchful stillness of someone being paid to wait indefinitely. The carriage itself was black with no ornamentation except a single emblem on the door, painted in dark red, depicting an unsheathed sword set against a field of nothing. Seraphine knew that emblem. Every person in the empire who had spent any time near the imperial court knew that emblem. She walked down the stone steps. She crossed the courtyard slowly, the ivory hem of her gown dragging across the cobblestones, the sound of her footsteps quiet and deliberate against the nighttime silence of the keep. The driver on the black carriage saw her coming and went absolutely rigid. He was a large man, and he gripped his reins like a man who very much wanted to consult with someone before making any decisions. The carriage door opened from the inside before she reached it. Lucien Vane stepped down onto the cobblestones. He was not what imperial propaganda made him look like. The woodcuts that circulated through the capital depicted him as enormous and bestial, a man built more like a weapon than a person, all scar tissue and military threat. The truth was more specific and, in some ways, more unsettling. He was tall but precisely proportioned, dressed in the plain dark clothing of a man who had no interest in being read by his appearance. His face was angular and still and watchful, carrying the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who have spent their lives calculating odds. He was not handsome the way courtiers were handsome, assembled for presentation, curated. He was something rawer than that, something that made the word handsome seem insufficient and slightly beside the point. He looked at her. He took in the wedding gown, the bare shoulders in the cold air, the absence of a coat, the absence of an escort, the direction from which she had come. He made no visible judgment. He made no performance of surprise. "Duchess," he said. His voice was quiet, a man's voice that had learned economy the way a soldier learns to travel light. "Not yet legally established as such," Seraphine said. "The marriage requires consummation under imperial law." A pause. "I'm aware of imperial law." "Then you understand the situation." "I understand several things about the situation," he said. He looked past her toward the lit windows of the keep's northeastern corner. He looked back at her. "What do you need?" It was the question that undid her slightly. Not the sympathy in it. There wasn't sympathy exactly, which was somehow the right call, but the directness. The absence of the social ceremony that would have required her to perform distress in a specific, legible way before anyone helped her. He had simply identified that she needed something and asked what it was. "Your carriage," she said. "Going east." He studied her for a moment. My nearest stronghold is 4 days' ride east. I know where it is. Another pause, longer this time. Somewhere behind her, across the courtyard, she heard a door open and the sudden murmur of voices. Guests who had seen her come outside, or servants who had run to find someone, or both. There are 30 people watching us right now, Lucien said, not looking away from her. Yes. This will be interpreted as a political statement. It will start a war. She met his eyes. They were a particular gray-green that the torchlight made impossible to read precisely, the color of something that was several things at once. She could hear the voices behind her growing, the sound of boots on cobblestones. Someone calling her name. One of the Draven household staff, probably, sent out to retrieve her with whatever combination of authority and diplomacy they could manufacture at this hour. The war already started, she said. He just forgot to tell me about it. Lucien Vane looked at her for one more moment. Then he stepped aside and held the carriage door open. She climbed in without looking back. He followed. The door closed. The driver, receiving some signal she hadn't seen, released the brake and moved the horses forward, and the black carriage began to roll through the gate of Draven Keep. Through the small window, Seraphine watched the torchlit courtyard recede. She saw the figure of the Draven household steward standing at the top of the front steps, one hand raised as if to call her back, his face a study in conflicted horror. She saw, on the third floor, the light still burning in the northeastern windows. She faced forward and didn't watch any longer. Lucien sat across from her in the carriage's narrow interior. He did not fill the silence with conversation. He did not ask her how she was feeling or perform any of the social gestures that men in his position used to manage women in hers. He sat with the stillness of someone who had made large decisions before, and understood that the space immediately after a large decision was not the time for noise. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The keep disappeared behind them. The road east was dark and unpaved beyond the city limits, and the carriage moved through countryside she couldn't see, marked only by the occasional light of a farmhouse window passing in the black distance. "You knew," she said finally. Not an accusation, a statement of architecture, placed carefully to see what it would hold. Lucien was quiet for a moment. "I knew he wasn't going to treat it like a marriage." "You were at the wedding." "I was observing." "Why?" He looked at her with an expression that was difficult to interpret precisely because it was so unconcealed. Most men in his position concealed things by default. It was a reflex, an ambient dishonesty learned from years of imperial politics. He looked as if concealment was simply not a mode he operated in. "Because Kael Draven acquiring a political alliance through your house changes the balance of Eastern power. I needed to see what the alliance looked like in practice." "And what did it look like?" "Like he hadn't thought past the ceremony." She turned and watched the dark countryside moving past the window. "He was with someone when I knocked on the door. I know who she is. He's known her for 4 years. She was at the wedding too." The information landed without surprising her. That was perhaps the strangest part of this entire night, the absence of surprise. As if some part of her had done all the work of being surprised weeks ago, quietly, in the hours spent reading between the lines of letters that were formal when they should have been personal, in the silences during courtship meetings that were too long to be comfortable and too short to be honest. The surprise had already happened. What she was experiencing now was something more specific and more durable. "He's going to come for me," she said. "He's going to send a delegation first. Try to resolve it through negotiation." "He won't come himself." "Not initially. He'll assess whether this is a move that can be contained." "Can it?" Lucien was quiet. "Tell me honestly," she said. "No," he said. "It cannot be contained. What happened tonight will be in the capital by morning. By the end of the week, it will have been interpreted, reinterpreted, and reconstructed into a dozen different political narratives, most of which will be broadly accurate. You walked out of a Draven marriage on your wedding night and entered my carriage in front of witnesses. The Empire will read that as an alliance." "Is it?" He met her eyes. "I don't make alliances I haven't agreed to." "You opened the door." "I was curious." "And now?" He was quiet again. This silence was different from the earlier ones, denser, more deliberate, the silence of a man working through a calculation that had more variables than he'd initially accounted for. "You're more composed than I expected," he said, "under these circumstances. I was raised for political marriages. I understand the landscape. Understanding the landscape and walking through it in a wedding gown at midnight are different exercises." "Yes." She almost smiled. It surprised her, the almost. "They are." The carriage hit a rough patch of road, and she put one hand against the paneling to steady herself. The ivory silk of her gown caught the light from the small interior lantern, throwing complicated shadows across the floor of the carriage. She looked down at the ring on her finger, the Draven crest, set in black stone, heavy and cold against her skin. She took it off. She held it for a moment. It was a significant piece. Masterwork silver, precisely sized, the kind of object made to outlast the person who wore it. She turned it once between her fingers. "There's a river we'll cross in about 2 hours," Lucien said, watching her. She looked up. "People throw things into rivers," he said, "for various reasons." She closed her hand around the ring. "Not yet," she said. "It's evidence." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. A recognition, maybe. The look of a man who has just recalibrated something. She put the ring in the small pocket sewn into the interior of her gown, where it sat against her hip like a cold weight and a promise, and she settled back into the carriage seat and looked out the window at the dark eastern road unrolling ahead of them. She thought about Kael. Not sentimentally. She had burned through most of her sentiment in the corridor, standing outside a locked door in her wedding gown with the sound of another woman's laughter in her ears. What she thought about now was tactical. What she thought about was the version of him she had observed during those 6 weeks of formal courtship, the precise nature of his cruelties and his withdrawals, the way he held power at a slight remove, as if he didn't trust it not to detonate in his hands. She had thought, initially, that his coldness was performance. Men in his position often performed coldness as a species of authority. But the locked door was not performance. The locked door was something more honest and, in its honesty, more devastatingly revealing. The locked door was a man who had wanted her to know exactly how little she mattered, in the clearest possible language, on the one night when the message was most destructive. People who delivered messages like that were not cold. They were wounded. They were wounded in ways they'd decided to make other people pay for, which was its own kind of cruelty. The kind that understood exactly what it was doing. She had married someone who understood exactly what he was doing. The carriage moved east through the dark, and the keep fell further behind them, and somewhere ahead, the eastern stronghold of Lucian Vane waited like a different kind of world entirely, with different rules and different consequences and different definitions of what a woman like her was worth. She let herself think about her father's letter one more time. The eastern borders, secured for a generation. The complicated man requiring patience and handling. She wondered what her father would say when the news reached him. She suspected he would be practical about it, which was its own kind of grief. Then she stopped wondering and started thinking about what came next. Lucian was watching her, not intrusively. He had a quality of observation that felt more like awareness than scrutiny, as if he monitored everything in his environment with equal impersonal attention, and she happened to be the most relevant element of his current environment. "You're already planning," he said. "I've been planning since I left the corridor." "What are you planning for?" She looked at him directly. He didn't flinch from it, which was notable. Most men flinched from direct eye contact with women who were angry in a controlled way. He returned her gaze with that same calm, calibrated attention, waiting. "Right now," she said, "I'm planning for the next 4 days. After that, I'll plan for whatever presents itself. Most people in your position would be planning for rescue, for a way to reverse what happened tonight." "I know." She held his gaze. "I'm not planning for rescue." The carriage hit another rough patch, and this time neither of them braced against it. Outside, the first suggestion of wind moved through the tree line, and the lanterns on the sides of the carriage swayed slightly, and the eastern road unreeled in front of them into the absolute darkness of a night that hadn't yet decided what it wanted to become. It was another hour before either of them spoke again. The quiet between them had settled into something almost workable, but not comfortable exactly, but honest in the way that silences between strangers who are about to become something else sometimes are. Seraphine had stopped watching the window and was sitting with her hands folded in her lap and her spine straight against the seat back, the posture of a woman who had refused sleep on the grounds that sleep was a form of surrender to the night. Lucien had his arms crossed and his head tilted slightly back, which might have looked like rest if his eyes had been closed. They were not closed. "You know what they'll call you," he said. "I know what they'll call me. It won't be accurate. Accuracy has never been the Empire's primary concern when naming women who inconvenience it." He looked at her. "You're not afraid of it. I'm afraid of things that can actually hurt me. Reputation is a variable. It can be rebuilt. What I left behind in that keep was structural." She paused. "The door, Lucien." He locked the door. It was the first time she'd used his name, and she watched him register it, not with surprise, but with a particular quality of attention, as if the word landing in that specific way, with that specific weight, had rearranged something slightly in his assessment of her. "I know," he said quietly. "Then you understand that there was no version of tonight where I stayed." "I understand it. Do you judge it?" Another pause. "This one different from the others?" "No," he said. "I don't judge it." He turned and looked out the window on his side of the carriage, at the dark countryside sliding past. "I've made decisions under worse conditions with less clarity." The admission was specific and, she sensed, unusual for him. Not a vulnerability offered easily or often. She filed it away without acknowledging it aloud, which she understood instinctively was the right call. The driver called down from the box, a brief announcement about the river crossing. Lucien glanced up, then back at her. "The ring," he said. "Still in my pocket. Still evidence." "Exactly." He nodded slowly, and something moved through his expression. Something that was not quite respect, because respect was too simple a word for it, but was in the vicinity of it, circling it from a watchful distance. The carriage rolled to the edge of the bridge, and the sound of water rose around them, and for a moment the whole conveyance was suspended between the road they'd left and the road that continued on the other side, the black river moving beneath them in the dark. Seraphine looked at the ring in her pocket, feeling its weight through the fabric. She left it there. The carriage crossed the bridge, and the sound of water fell away behind them, and the eastern road pulled them forward into a night that smelled of pine resin and cold earth and the particular sharpness of air that had never had to accommodate anyone's grief. She did not know yet what Lucien Vane's stronghold would feel like, or what shape her life would take inside it. She did not know what Cale Draven would do in the morning when he found her gone, or what political machinery would begin moving the moment the story reached the capital. She did not know what the Empire would make of her, or what she would make of the Empire now that she was no longer its most recent obedient daughter. What she knew was this. She was moving east, in the dark, in a black carriage with an emblem that meant something frightening to everyone who recognized it, and she was still wearing her wedding gown, and the ring was in her pocket, and she was not crying. She had thought she might cry, at some point in the last several hours. She had waited for it with a kind of detached expectation, the way you wait for rain that has been threatening all day. But it hadn't come. What had come instead was something colder and cleaner, and ultimately more useful, a kind of clarity that arrived in the space where something softer had been expected. She understood now that her father had been right about one thing. Cale Draven was a complicated man. He simply wasn't complicated in any of the ways Hadrian Vale had anticipated. She looked at Lucien Vane across the narrow interior of the carriage and found him already looking at her. "Get some sleep," he said. "The road gets rougher past the forest line." "Does it?" "Yes. I'm not going to sleep." "I know," he said. "I said it anyway." Something about this, the specific quality of the exchange, the acknowledgement of what was true without insisting on any particular response to it, loosened something very slightly in her chest. Not grief, not relief, something with less name to it than either of those. The carriage moved deeper into the east. The torches fell further behind. Above them, through the small window, the sky had moved past cloud cover into something cleaner, and the stars were out, sharp and indifferent, and very far away. 3 more days to the stronghold. She looked at her own hands in the low light of the interior lantern. The ring finger where the Draven band had sat for 6 hours still showed its impression in the skin, a faint mark, the ghost of a weight that was no longer there. She pressed her thumb against it. Then, from the driver's box above, without warning, the sound of the driver swearing sharply, followed immediately by the unmistakable crack of a crossbow bolt embedding itself in the wood of the carriage frame. Lucien was moving before the second sound arrived. The bolt had taken a chunk out of the door frame 6 inches above her head. Seraphine did not scream. She registered this about herself with a strange, distant precision. The absence of the scream, the way her body had chosen compression over explosion, drawing inward rather than outward, and she filed it away as information about what she was made of while the carriage lurched hard to the left, and Lucien Vane dropped from his seat and pulled her down with him onto the floor in a single movement that had no wasted motion in it at all. "Stay down," he said. Not a request. "How many?" "Don't know yet." He was already moving. He got his back against the door on the left side of the carriage and drew a short blade from somewhere inside his coat with the ease of a man retrieving something familiar. Above them, the driver was shouting, orders or curses, she couldn't separate them, and the horses had gone from canter to something faster and less controlled. The carriage frame shuddering over the road, the interior lantern swinging in violent arcs and throwing shadows that made the small space feel even smaller. Another bolt. This one hit the roof. Lucien went still in that way he had, that absolute economy of movement, listening to the intervals. She watched him count. He held up 3 fingers. 3 shooters. She thought about the road they'd traveled. The tree line on the east side, dense and close. The bridge they'd crossed 40 minutes ago, which would have been visible from a high point. Someone had been watching the keep. Someone had known which carriage was his and which direction it would go. "Draven?" she said. Lucien's jaw tightened. Not his style. He looked at the door. "Brace." She braced. He kicked the door open on the left side, the side away from the tree line, and went through it while the carriage was still moving, catching the frame and pulling himself up onto the running board with a grip that looked like it had done this before. She heard him moving above her, across the roof, toward the driver's box, and then there was a different kind of noise, shorter, more deliberate, and one of the shooters in the tree line stopped shooting. The carriage slowed. Gradually, then completely, rolling to a stop on the road's left shoulder with the horses blowing hard and the driver applying the brake with both hands and swearing in a dialect she didn't fully recognize. Silence. The particular silence of a situation that might be over or might not be. Seraphine stayed on the floor with her back against the seat, and the Draven ring pressing into her hip through the pocket and her own breathing loud in her ears. She was counting. 20 seconds. 30. The carriage had stopped moving. The horses were still agitated, shifting in their traces, but the blind panic had left them. The door opened. Lucien looked in at her. He had a cut along the left side of his jaw, shallow, already closing. His expression was the same as it had been in the carriage before the attack, calibrated, watchful, giving her no performance of urgency now that the urgency had passed. "Clear," he said. She took his hand and stepped out onto the road. The night was cold and very quiet. The trees stood dark on both sides of the road, and the torches on the carriage lanterns had somehow survived and were throwing unsteady light across the scene. The stopped carriage, the 2 horses, the driver up on his box checking himself for damage, and 30 feet back up the road, a figure on the ground that she looked at once and then didn't look at again. "2 got away," Lucien said. He was scanning the tree line, still reading the dark for movement. "Who sent them?" He said a name, not Cale Draven's. She turned to look at him. "The Imperial Council?" "A faction of it, possibly the same faction that arranged for your marriage." He said this without inflection, the way you state weather. "Your alliance with the Vale House was supposed to bring Draven into compliance with certain economic arrangements in the north. When it became clear Draven wasn't going to be manageable through marriage, the arrangement became a liability." He glanced at her. "You became a liability. Within 6 hours of the wedding. They're efficient." She looked at the road ahead of them, east. Still 4 days. She looked at the tree line, which was just trees again now, dark and indifferent. She looked at the carriage door with the bolt hole in the frame. "You knew this was a possibility," she said. "I knew it was a probability." "When?" He was quiet. "When you opened the carriage door," she said. Not an accusation, but she was past that, past the stage of the night where she had the luxury of being wounded by information. This was calculation. She needed the shape of what she was inside. "You knew they might come for me tonight, and you opened the door anyway." He met her eyes. "I opened the door because you knocked on it. The calculation wasn't about whether it was safe. The calculation was about whether leaving you at Draven Keep was worse. Was it?" "Yes." "Flat. Certain. They have contacts inside the keep. If you'd gone back inside that building tonight, the next opportunity would have been cleaner, and you wouldn't have seen it coming." She stood with the cold road under her feet, and the wedding gown heavy around her legs, and the information settling into her like cold water finding its level. She thought about the corridor, the locked door, the sound of the other woman's laughter. She thought about how she had stood there and felt the floor of her life fall out from under her, and how the thing that had replaced it was not grief, but something harder and more structural. She thought about how everything she had been told this marriage would give her had been constructed, possibly, to make her useful to people she had never met, for purposes she had never been consulted about. "Tell me what they want," she said. Lucian studied her. The cut on his jaw had stopped bleeding. Behind him, the driver had climbed down from the box and was inspecting the horses, running his hands along their legs with professional efficiency. And the scene had the strange, mundane quality of an emergency that was over except for the paperwork. "Tomorrow," he said. "Get back in the carriage." "Tell me now." A pause. He looked at her with that same quality of attention, that thing that was not quite assessment and not quite recognition, but something operating between them. The way two people look at each other when they're trying to determine whether the other one is going to be a problem or an asset, and they suspect the answer might be both. "They want the eastern trade routes," he said. "They've wanted them for 15 years. Draven controls the northern access. I control the eastern passage. If the Vale House's political weight had shifted Draven into alignment with the Council's proxy infrastructure, the last piece would have been cutting my supply lines." He watched her absorb this. "You were the weight. They needed you married to him and compliant and inside that keep. And now you're in my carriage." He said it simply, without self-satisfaction, which is the version of events they could not afford. She was quiet for a moment. The horses had settled. The driver had finished his inspection and was looking east down the road with the resignation of a man who wanted to be moving again. The night was not getting warmer. "Get in the carriage," Lucian said again. Different tone this time. Quieter. She looked at him. "You should know something." "Tell me." "I'm not going to be useful to you the way they wanted me to be useful to Kael. I'm not weight you apply to a political structure and wait for results. If I'm in your carriage and in your stronghold, I'm in them as a person who thinks and decides." He waited. "If that's not what you opened the door for," she said, "say so now." The road was silent around them. Far off in the tree line, something moved. An animal, small, nothing threatening, and both of them clocked it without breaking eye contact, which was its own kind of information. "Get in the carriage," he said, for the third time. And this time there was something in it that was not an order and not quite an invitation, but occupied the space where those two things met. She got in the carriage. He followed. The driver remounted. The horses moved east. She did not sleep. He did not pretend she would. The stronghold came into view at the end of the fourth day, emerging from the eastern plateau like something that had been there before the mountain and had simply waited for the mountain to grow up around it. Vanehold. She had heard it described in intelligence reports her father had kept on the Empire's major military figures. Cold, fortified, built for function rather than display, a place that announced its purpose without decoration or apology. The intelligence reports had been accurate as far as they went, and wrong in the ways that intelligence reports about places are always wrong. They described the structure and missed the quality of it, the way it sat in the landscape with the particular gravity of a thing that had survived everything thrown at it and had no remaining interest in being impressive about that fact. She stepped out of the carriage in the outer courtyard and looked up. The walls were 40 feet of dark stone, scarred in places and repaired without aesthetic concern, the repairs visible and deliberate, not hidden, as if the damage and its mending were both part of the record. Around the courtyard, men stopped what they were doing and looked at her, not with hostility, with the careful, assessing attention of people who lived in a place where every new element was a variable to be evaluated. She looked back. She had been cold for 4 days. She had slept in intervals and eaten what the driver produced from provisions under the box, and she was still wearing the wedding gown because she had nothing else, though she had torn 6 inches off the hem on the second day when it had caught on a wheel, spoke during a brief stop. The ivory silk was road-dusted and travel-creased, and she had wound her hair back with a strip of the torn hem because it had come loose somewhere around the second day's journey, and she had no pins. She was aware of how she looked. She had assessed it clinically and decided it was information she could work with. Lucian came to stand beside her. He was looking at his men with an expression they clearly recognized, something that communicated several things at once without specifying any of them. "Quarters are prepared in the east wing," he said. "Is there a bath?" "Yes." "Clothes?" He looked at the wedding gown. "We'll find something by tonight." "I need access to a writing desk." He looked at her. "Tonight?" "Tonight." A pause. "Who are you writing to?" "My father first, then I'm going to draft something to the Imperial Council." She held his gaze. "The faction that sent those shooters. I want them to know I'm alive and that I know who they are." Something moved in his expression. It wasn't amusement this time, or not only that. It was a more complex register, the look of a man who had made a specific kind of calculation and was now wondering whether the result was going to exceed his original estimate. "Writing to the council from inside my stronghold will be interpreted as a declaration," he said. "Yes. You understand that." "Lucien." She turned to face him directly. 3 nights ago, I was standing outside a locked door in a palace I was supposed to live in for the rest of my life. 2 nights ago, someone tried to put a crossbow bolt through my head. Last night, I slept sitting upright in a carriage with a knife in my lap that your driver lent me because you told him to. She paused. "I am done waiting for other people to decide what I'm declaring." He was quiet. Around them, the courtyard had gone back to its work. Men and horses and the ordinary sounds of a military compound that had found its rhythm and kept it. The wind off the plateau moved through the space between them and carried the smell of iron and cold stone and distance. "There's a writing desk in the east wing," he said finally. "I'll have the fire lit." She followed him inside. The east wing of Vanehold was nothing like the keep. Where Draven Keep had been designed to produce awe, ceilings built to make you feel small, corridors lit to make arrivals feel observed, Vanehold's interior was built for use. High ceilings, but for ventilation. Wide corridors, but for movement of men and equipment. Fires in every room, but for heat rather than atmosphere. It was a building that had no interest in what you thought of it. She found she trusted it immediately, which was interesting. The room assigned to her was large and plain and warm, with a window that looked east over the plateau, and a writing desk positioned near the fire, and a set of clothing folded on the chest at the foot of the bed. A man's shirt and heavy wool trousers and a belt, none of it sized for her, but all of it clean and functional. She held up the shirt and looked at it, and then looked at the wedding gown she was still wearing, and made a decision that felt less like practicality and more like a ceremony of some kind, personal and witnessed by no one. She changed. She sat at the writing desk with the fire at her back and the east wind talking against the window glass, and she wrote to her father first, as she'd said she would, short, direct, factual. She told him what had happened, in the order in which it had happened, without editorializing. She told him she was alive and housed and making decisions, which she understood he would find alarming, and she told him that the political situation was more complex than the marriage had presented, and that she would explain further when she knew more. She sealed it and set it aside. Then she sat for a long time without writing anything. She thought about the locked door. She thought about the crossbow bolt in the carriage frame. She thought about Lucien's voice in the dark saying they wanted the eastern trade routes, and she was the weight. She thought about all the rooms she had been inside in her life. Her father's study. The Imperial Council chambers she had observed from the gallery. The negotiating rooms and receiving halls and formal dining spaces, and finally the corridor outside the bridal chamber where she had knocked twice and received 2 words and understood that the shape of her life had just changed irrevocably. The thing about being made into a weight, she thought, was that the people who did it were never paying attention to the direction the weight might eventually move on its own. She pulled a fresh sheet and began writing to the council. She had been at it for 20 minutes when the knock came at her door. Lucien. She could tell by the quality of it, the same precise double knock she had used on the bridal chamber door, which she suspected was coincidental and also suspected was not. "Come in," she said without looking up. He entered and stopped just inside the doorway. He looked at the desk, the letter in progress, her new clothes, the wedding gown folded with some care on the chest beside the military clothing. He looked at her face. "The council faction has a name," he said. "I'll have it for you by morning." "I already know the name," she said. She watched him. "I read my father's correspondence files on the journey to the capital 6 months ago. He has a file on every significant political player in the empire, and I memorized the ones that touched the Vale House's interests. I've known who runs the Eastern Trade Proxy for 4 years. She paused. "I just needed confirmation that they were the ones who ordered the attack." He was very still. "You have 3 names in your head right now," she said. "If they match mine, we can stop performing the part where you manage what information I receive." He said 3 names. They matched. He looked at her with an expression that had finally moved past all of its previous registers into something unguarded and specific. And in the firelight, for the first time, she could read it clearly. Not just calculation, not just assessment, but a kind of recognition that had been building for 4 days and had just arrived at its destination. "What are you?" he said, not unkindly. "I'm the weight," she said, "that just decided which direction to fall." She turned back to the letter. He didn't leave. Outside on the plateau, the wind had picked up, moving hard from the northeast. The direction of the capital, the direction of Draven Keep, the direction of everyone who had spent the last 6 months arranging Seraphine Vale's life without bothering to consult her about it. She wrote. She was 3 sentences from the end of the letter when the door below the east wing opened and she heard boots on stone, fast, purposeful, the specific cadence of someone bringing news that couldn't wait. And Lucien turned toward the sound with his hand already moving to the blade at his hip, and the knock on the room's inner door came hard, and the soldier who entered was out of breath and holding a sealed dispatch with the Draven crest on it. Duke Cale Draven was not sending a delegation. He was coming himself. And according to the dispatch, he had brought an army. The dispatch was 4 days old. Lucien read it once, handed it to her without comment, and walked to the window. She read it standing up because sitting felt like the wrong posture for information that moved this fast. Cale Draven had mobilized 3 legions from the northern garrison within 36 hours of the wedding. Not a diplomatic column, not an escort. 3 legions, which was a number that meant something specific in imperial military language. It meant he wasn't coming to negotiate, wasn't coming to retrieve, wasn't coming to perform the public theater of a husband reclaiming a wayward wife for the benefit of the court's gossip infrastructure. 3 legions meant he had made a decision, and the decision was irreversible, and he wanted everyone in the empire to know it before he arrived. She set the dispatch on the desk beside the unfinished letter. "He's 4 days out," she said. 3 now. The dispatch was delayed at the crossing. Lucien was still at the window, looking east over the plateau. His voice had the particular flatness of a man running variables. "He'll hit the Vey Pass before we can reinforce it adequately." "How many men do you have here?" "Enough for a siege, not enough for open engagement at the pass." "Then we don't engage at the pass." He turned from the window. "What do you propose?" She looked at the dispatch again. The Draven crest at the top pressed hard into the wax. The mark of a seal applied with more force than strictly necessary, which told her something about the state of the hand that had pressed it. She thought about the man she had observed for 6 weeks of courtship. The jaw turned away during the ceremony. The 2 words through the locked door. She thought about what Lucien had said on the road. His cruelty came from somewhere. And cruelty with a source was a different tactical problem than cruelty as a fixed characteristic. A man coming with 3 legions to retrieve his wife on their wedding night was not a man who didn't care. He was a man who cared in the worst possible way. "We let him come," she said. Lucienne was very still. Seraphine. He's not coming to destroy you. If he wanted to destroy Vainhold, he would have sent the legions first and come himself afterward. He came himself first, which means this is still, in his mind, a personal situation that military force is backing up. She met his eyes. If we engage him at the pass, it becomes a war. If we let him come to the gate, it's still a negotiation. And if the negotiation fails, then it becomes a war from a better position. She paused. I'll speak to him. The silence in the room was the kind that happens when one person has said something the other person finds simultaneously strategically sound and personally alarming. You'll speak to him, Lucian said. I was married to him 6 hours ago. I have standing. Standing. He said the word with a careful absence of inflection that communicated more than inflection would have. I know what you're thinking. Do you? You're thinking I'll go to the gate and he'll say something, and whatever I feel about the locked door and the wedding night and the 4 days in the carriage will become operationally complicated. She held his gaze. I don't work that way. He studied her, long enough that she felt the weight of it. Not uncomfortable, but specific, the way you feel a window open in a room that has been closed a long time. Then he said, I'll have the gate prepared, and turned back to the window, and that was the end of the discussion. She finished the letter to the council in 20 minutes. She did not soften it, but Cale Draven arrived on the morning of the 3rd day. She heard the column before she saw it. The particular low vibration of heavy cavalry moving in formation felt in the stone of the walls before it registered in the ears, the kind of sound that the body responds to with a primal and entirely involuntary increase in heart rate. She was on the inner parapet with 2 of Lucien's officers when the Draven colors appeared at the edge of the plateau's approach road, black and deep crimson, the pennant snapping hard in the northeast wind. He had not brought 3 legions to the gate. He had come with a personal guard of 40. A deliberate choice, she understood immediately. A choice that said, I could have brought the legions, and I didn't, which was its own kind of statement, and possibly more dangerous than the legions would have been. She watched him ride in at the column's head. He was on a black horse, and he sat it the way he sat everything, with a contained, deliberate stillness that was never quite relaxed. He was not in ceremonial dress. He wore campaign armor, dark, functional, the kind of armor designed for actual use rather than display. He had ridden hard for 3 days, and it showed in the horse and the men and in something around his eyes that she could read from the parapet, even at this distance, as a specific kind of controlled damage. He looked up. She didn't move. He held her gaze for a long moment from the approach road. Around him, his guard had halted. Behind her, she could feel Lucien's men doing the same kind of watching that soldiers do when a situation is balanced on its edge, and everyone is waiting for the variable that determines which way it tips. She walked down from the parapet. The meeting happened in Vainhold's outer receiving room. Stone walls, no ornamentation, a fire going in the corner hearth, and a table with 2 chairs that someone had placed facing each other in the center of the room, with the deliberate geometry of a space being prepared for a specific kind of confrontation. Lucien was present, standing at the room's eastern wall with his arms crossed. 2 of Kael's senior officers stood behind him at the door. No weapons had been drawn. No weapons had been requested to be sheathed. The weapons were simply there, present in the room, one more variable in the balance. Kael walked in and looked at her. She sat in one of the chairs and looked back. He looked different at close range than he had at the ceremony. The ceremony had imposed its own staging on him. The formal posture, the ducal composure worn like plate armor over whatever was operating underneath. Here, in this room, after 3 days of hard riding and whatever had happened in his mind during those 3 days, the composure was thinner, still present. But she could see the effort it was costing him. He did not sit. He stood on the other side of the table and looked at her with something in his expression that she hadn't expected and didn't immediately have a name for. You're unhurt, he said. Yes. There was an attack on the road. I'm aware. I was there. His jaw moved. Seraphine, Duke Draven, her voice was level. You came here with 40 men when you could have come with 3 legions. That tells me you want a conversation and not a siege. So sit down and have the conversation. A pause. Something crossed his face. He sat. Lucien at the wall did not move, did not speak, was present in the room the way a structural element is present, load-bearing, immovable, not performing anything. Cale looked at her. He looked at Lucien. He looked back at her. The calculation in his eyes was rapid and clearly painful, and she watched him work through it and come out the other side at a place he clearly hadn't expected to arrive. "You're not here as a prisoner," he said. Not quite a question. "No. You came willingly. I walked out the front entrance of your keep and got into his carriage in front of 40 witnesses," she said. "Yes, willingly." His hands were flat on the table. She could see the tendons in them. "What were you thinking?" he said, and the question came out differently than she expected. Not cold, not commanding, but with a raw edge under it that was the sound of a man who had asked himself this question for 3 days and had not found a satisfying answer. "I was thinking," she said carefully, "that standing in a corridor outside a locked door in a wedding gown is a position that only has one logical exit." The room went very quiet. "I was handling a situation," he said. "You were handling a situation." She repeated it back without inflection, and she watched the words land on him and watched him feel them land. "You were handling a situation on your wedding night, and the way you chose to handle it was to lock the door and not manage it until morning. And the message that sent was precise and deliberate, and you knew exactly what it would do." "I didn't—" He stopped. "You did," she said. "You're not a man who does things without knowing what they'll do. That's the one thing I understood about you in 6 weeks of watching you operate." Cale Draven looked at her for a long moment. Something was moving in him that she couldn't fully read. Not shame, exactly, because shame was too simple for what was in his face. Something more fractured than that. Something that had been fractured for a long time and had just been hit in the exact place where the fracture ran deepest. He said nothing. Lucien straightened from the wall. "There's a more pressing matter." Kael's eyes moved to him. The temperature in the room dropped several degrees in a very short time. "The attack on the road," Lucien said, "was ordered by Baron Solch's faction on the Imperial Council. The same faction that arranged this marriage through back channels in your father's administration 4 years before his death." He let that land. "They needed you aligned. They used the Veil Alliance to try to accomplish it. When it became clear you weren't going to be useful in the way they planned, they tried to eliminate the loose variable." Kael was very still. "They tried to kill her," Lucien said with the flat precision of someone reading coordinates, "because she is the only person alive who has knowledge of the Veil House intelligence files, which include documentation of Solce's Eastern proxy arrangement dating back 11 years. Her father kept records. She read them." Kael turned to look at her. She met his eyes. "Your father's steward," she said. "Aldrich Vane. He's been in correspondence with Solce's office for 6 years." The silence that followed was so complete she could hear the fire. Kael's expression did something she had not seen it do before. Not in 6 weeks of observation, not at the ceremony, not in the brief exchange through the locked door. It broke. Not dramatically. He wasn't a man built for dramatic breaking. But something behind the composure shifted in a way that was irreversible. A structural change in a face she had been studying for 6 weeks and thought she understood, and she realized she had understood the surface of him and nothing beneath it. "Aldrich," he said. A single word. Almost no sound in it. "He's been feeding your position assessments to Solce's network since your father's illness. The network knew your troop movements, your supply lines, your alliance negotiations." She paused. "They knew about me 3 months before your father's man officially approached mine." Kael stood up. He turned away from the table and walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room, and the silence that came from him was not the silence of a man composing himself, but the silence of a man standing in the wreckage of something he had built his entire adult life on and trying to determine what, if any of it, was still structurally sound. She watched his back. She watched the particular stillness of a man who was not going to show what this was doing to him, not because he didn't feel it, but because showing it was not available to him in this body, in this life, in this version of himself that had been constructed layer by layer from the outside in until the construction was indistinguishable from the person. She understood this, in a way that was not sympathy, but was its nearest functional neighbor. "How long have you known?" he said, to the window. "About Aldrich, 4 days. About Solti, 4 years." She was quiet for a moment. "About the way you were going to treat this marriage, since the second week of courtship." He turned from the window. His face was still composed. The composure was costing him something visible now, in the set of his jaw and the quality of his eyes, but it was still there. The habit of self-containment so deeply grooved it operated independently of what was happening underneath it. "Then why—" He stopped, started again. "Why go through with it?" Because the alternative was watching the Vale Province's eastern border destabilize over a broken negotiation, and I calculated that even a bad marriage was a more useful position than no position. She held his gaze. "I made a strategic error. I underestimated the degree of bad." Something moved across his face. "Seraphine, I'm not finished." Her voice was still level. She kept it level with the same effort she kept everything level, the habit her father had built in her over 20 years of sitting in rooms where the wrong emotion at the wrong moment cost more than the situation warranted. "The council is moving. Solti has enough documentation to begin a case for imperial intervention in the eastern provinces, which means he can legally mobilize the emperor's military apparatus against both of you, against both of us." She put her hands on the table. "The 3 of us in this room are the only people who have standing, evidence, and combined military force sufficient to stop it." The room was quiet. Lucien was watching Kael with the particular watchfulness of a man who has made his own assessment and is now waiting to see whether the other person's assessment will align. Kael looked at her. He looked at Lucien. He looked back at her, and something in the architecture of his expression had shifted in a way that was fundamental. Not softened, not broken down into something accessible and comfortable, but rearranged, as if the impact of the last 10 minutes had moved things into a different configuration that he hadn't chosen and wasn't sure yet how to inhabit. "You want an alliance," he said. "I want the people who put a crossbow bolt through the frame of a carriage I was sitting in to face a combined force they cannot manage." She paused. "What you want is your own calculation." He was quiet for a long time. Then, from outside the room, from the direction of the outer gate, where his men and Lucien's men were currently occupying the same courtyard, with the careful mutual wariness of 2 predators sharing a water source, a sound came that cut through every calculation in the room and replaced it with something more urgent. Horns. Imperial horns. Not from Kael's column. From the south. The Emperor's forces. Moving north at military pace. And in Kael's face, as he turned toward the sound, she saw it. The thing she had not expected to see. The thing that rearranged her own calculation in a way she had no prepared response for. Not military assessment, not political calculation. Something rawer than both. Something that looked, in the cold morning light of Vanehold's receiving room, uncomfortably like the expression of a man who had come 3 days' hard ride not to reclaim property, not to protect a political investment, but because the thought of her in danger had been the one thing his composure had not been able to contain. She filed it away. The horn sounded again, closer. And in this room, with its 2 chairs and its fire, and its 3 people who had every reason to destroy each other, the war they had each been fighting separately arrived at their door as a single shared emergency. And the only question left, the one none of them had the luxury of avoiding, was whether the thing that had broken between them tonight was broken beyond use, or whether it was broken in the specific way that sometimes, under enough pressure, becomes the only foundation left to build on. Lucien moved to the door. "We have perhaps 2 hours before they reach the plateau approach." Kael's hand was on his sword. His eyes were on her. She stood up. "Then we have 2 hours," she said, "to decide what we are to each other." 2 hours was not what they had. The first scout came back inside 40 minutes with blood on his collar and a revised estimate that reduced the Imperial column's arrival time by half. Solsi had pushed his vanguard through the night, bypassing the southern way station entirely, which meant either he had intelligence on their position more current than the dispatch, or he had made a calculation that speed mattered more than formation. Both possibilities were bad in different ways. Lucien had his officers in the outer hall within 5 minutes of the horns. Kael's senior men had come in from the courtyard without being asked, which was either pragmatism or the beginning of something that didn't have a name yet. The room had the specific quality of a space that has just changed its function. It had been a receiving room an hour ago, and now it was a war room, and the furniture that remained was irrelevant to everything happening in it. Seraphine stood at the table with the dispatch and 3 days of accumulated intelligence and her own memory of her father's files, and she started talking. She talked for 11 minutes without stopping. She laid out Soltzi's supply chain vulnerabilities, the Eastern Proxy Network's 3 primary communication nodes, the legal mechanism the Council faction would use to justify Imperial military action, and the specific procedural gap in Imperial law that made that justification contestable if challenged from 2 noble houses simultaneously. She talked about the Vey Pass approach and the plateau's northern ridgeline, and the timing of the second column she was certain existed because Solse did not commit a primary force without a contingency, and the contingency would come from the north. When she stopped, the room was very quiet. Kael was looking at her the way she had not seen him look at anything before. Lucien said, "The northern ridge. I have 12 men up there." "You need 30. "I have 12. "Then we move Draven's guard to the ridge and use your 12 as the visible forward position at the gate." She looked at Kael. "Your men on the ridge read as a separate force. Solse's northern contingency hits what looks like a lightly defended flank and finds 40 trained soldiers on high ground." Kael was already turning to his officer. "Do it." The officer left. 3 of Lucien's men left with him. The room thinned out into its essential components. The 2 of them, and Lucien, and the map on the table, and the sound of boots on stone moving fast in every corridor of Vanehold as the stronghold rearranged itself around a new reality. Lucien looked at the map. "They'll target the gate first. Conventional approach. They want this to look like a lawful intervention, not a military assault, which means they'll demand surrender before they breach." "How long does the demand give us?" Kael said. 20 minutes by Imperial protocol. Possibly less if Solse has already obtained a preemptive order." "He has," Seraphine said. "He'll have had it prepared before the column moved. He's been planning this since the wedding." Both men looked at her. "He planned the wedding," she said flatly. "He planned everything that came after it. The attack on the road was a contingency for the scenario where I didn't stay in the keep and cooperate. The Imperial column is the contingency for the scenario where I survived the road." She looked at the map. "We are currently inside his 3rd contingency. He has a 4th. Whatever we plan assuming he has already planned the response to it." Hale said, "Then we stop responding to his plan." She looked at him. "We take the initiative before the column reaches the gate," he said. His voice had changed. Not warmer. Warmer was not a mode he operated in, she had accepted this. But more direct. The particular quality of a man who has stopped managing his own presentation and is simply operating. Solche is with the column. He's too invested in this to stay in the capital. Lucien's eyes moved to Kael with a new quality of attention. "You know his position." "He was at my father's table for 6 years. I know how he moves." Kael's jaw was set. He'll be in the 2nd rank of the column, protected. He doesn't lead from the front because he's never had to. He's always had other men's fronts to operate behind. "So we pull him out of the 2nd rank," Lucien said, "before the column reaches the gate." Kael looked up from the map. "Small group, fast. Hit the column on the approach road where the plateau narrows. There's a section 2 miles south where the road cuts between the rock face and the drop. 4 men wide, maximum. The column has to compress." Lucien was quiet, reading the map, reading the proposal, reading something in Kael's face that was taking him a moment to fully assess. "You're describing a direct extraction from a moving Imperial column." "Yes." "With what force?" "Yours and mine combined. 12 men, fast horses." "If it fails, it won't fail." Kael said it without bravado, with the flat certainty of a man who had located the exact weight of the risk and had already decided to carry it. "It won't fail because the alternative is waiting inside these walls for Solke to apply his 4th contingency, and I am done waiting inside walls for other people's contingencies." He said it to Lucien, but he was looking at her. She held his gaze. She understood what he was doing, and she understood why, and she understood that the understanding itself was the problem, that she had spent 6 weeks learning to read him from a strategic distance, and that distance was collapsing in real time, and there was no clean way to manage that collapse while simultaneously managing an imperial military column on a plateau approach road. "Go," she said. He held her gaze for one more second. Then he was moving. Pause. She watched them ride out from the northern parapet. 12 men, dark clothing, no pennants or colors. Kael at the front, Lucien beside him, which was the image she would have found impossible to construct in her mind 3 days ago, and which now had the terrible clarity of something inevitable. 2 men who had been trying to destroy each other's political infrastructure for 3 years, riding out together in the cold morning light of a plateau toward a problem that was larger than both of them. And the fact that it had taken this specific sequence of catastrophes to produce this specific coalition was not lost on her. She turned from the parapet and went to work. She had 20 minutes, possibly less. She used them. She found Lucien's senior officer in the outer hall and walked him through the gate defense. Where to position, what signal to wait for, how to handle the protocol demand if the column arrived before the extraction team returned. She found the Draven officer who had stayed behind and gave him the ridgeline instructions in specific enough terms that there was no room for interpretation. She went back to the writing desk in the East Wing and wrote 2 more letters, one to the Imperial Court Recorder, which was a legal document, and one to her father, which was something more personal and took longer to write and said things she had not said in her 11-minute briefing. She sealed them both. She heard the column reach the approach road before she heard anything from the extraction team. The sound came up through the stone of the walls first, that same low vibration from the night of Kael's arrival, but heavier this time, more sustained, the sound of a much larger force moving in organized formation. She went to the southern parapet and saw the imperial pennants at the far end of the approach road, gold and black, the Emperor's colors, which meant Solse had obtained the highest tier of authorization he could carry without the Emperor himself present. The column slowed as it hit the narrow section 2 miles south. She watched it compress, the formation folding into itself as the road narrowed between rock face and drop, the pennants bunching together, the orderly ranks becoming something denser and less mobile. She watched it the way her father had taught her to watch military movements. Not the center, where the obvious things were happening, but the edges, where the real information lived. At the edges, something was wrong. The column's second rank was not compressing with the rest. It was holding back, slightly, with the particular hesitation of a group of men who have just registered an unexpected variable and are waiting for instruction. She exhaled. The extraction had made contact. What followed was 7 minutes she would spend years reconstructing in accurate sequence. The column's front half had stopped moving. There was a disturbance in the second rank, visible even from the parapet as a sudden disruption in the organized geometry of the formation, men turning toward something rather than facing forward, the pennant swaying in the wrong direction. The sound reached her in fragments, carried by the plateau wind in uneven intervals. Shouting, the clash of metal, a horse screaming, then a very specific kind of silence that fell over large formations when something has gone drastically wrong at the center of command. Then the horn. Not Imperial, Lucy. Short, 2 notes, repeated. The signal she had helped design 40 minutes ago in the war room, meaning the extraction was complete and the team was moving back to the stronghold. She turned from the parapet and ran. They came through the northern gate with 8 of the 12 horses and 7 of the 12 men. She was in the courtyard when they rode in, and she counted fast and kept her face still and counted again. Kael was there. He was on his horse and upright and present, which was the first thing she assessed, and the assessment happened before she had consciously decided to make it, which was its own category of information about herself that she set aside for later. He had a cut along his right forearm, dark through the sleeve, and he was moving with the careful economy of a man managing pain without showing it, which she recognized because she had watched him move with exactly that quality of economy for 6 weeks and had mistaken it for coldness. Lucien was there, unhurt, as far as she could tell. His expression was different from anything she had seen on him in 4 days. Not the calibrated watchfulness, not the controlled assessment. Something more open than that. something that looked, briefly, like the face of a man who had just tested the outermost limit of something and had found it held. Between them, held by two of Lucien's men, was a figure in imperial advisor's robes with a broken-off crossbow bolt still lodged in the wood of his traveling chair's armrest, and his face arranged in the expression of a man who has spent years behind other men's fronts and has just discovered that the front has found him. Baron Solce looked older than the intelligence reports had suggested, shorter, more ordinary. She had built him in her mind over 4 years of reading her father's files into something architectural, a fixed presence in the Empire's corrupt infrastructure, permanent and load-bearing. In the courtyard of Vayenhold, in the cold morning light, with 2 soldiers holding his arms and his column leaderless on the approach road, he looked like what he was, a man who had made very large bets for a very long time and had finally run out of other people's money to lose. His eyes found her immediately. "Duchess Vale," he said. His voice was steady. She gave him credit for that. "You've made a significant miscalculation." "Tell me about it," she said. "The Emperor's proxy order authorizes military. The proxy order is contestable under Article 14 of the Imperial Compact, which requires documentary evidence of noble house violation submitted to the court recorder before military mobilization." She held his gaze. "I filed the counter-documentation from this stronghold 40 minutes ago via Imperial Post. The recorder will have it before your column can reorganize." She paused. "You moved too fast. You didn't give the legal architecture time to set." Something shifted in his face. Fast. Then controlled again, but she had seen it. "You had those documents prepared before the wedding," he said. "I had them prepared before I left my father's house." She took one step toward him. "You planned this marriage 4 years ago. I started planning for what came after it 3 years and 11 months ago." The courtyard was very quiet. Kael had dismounted. He was standing 6 feet to her left, and she could feel him there the way you feel a change in pressure. Not looking at her, looking at Solce, but present with a quality of attention that was different from anything she had calibrated about him before. Solce looked between them. He looked at Lucien. He made one more calculation, visible in the tightening around his eyes, and then he made the decision that men in his position always made too late. He stopped calculating and started negotiating. "What do you want?" he said. "Everything," she said. "The proxy network, the Eastern trade documentation, the correspondence with your contacts in the Draven administration, which includes 6 years of letters to a man named Aldrich Vane." She watched his face. "I want the full record, presented to the Imperial Court Recorder with your personal testimony." "You're asking me to, I'm asking you to survive this," she said, "which is more than you offered me on the road." The silence stretched. Behind Solce, through the northern gate, they could hear the Imperial column on the approach road. The sound of a formation that had lost its command structure and was holding position, waiting for orders that weren't coming. The particular suspended sound of military machinery with no one at the controls. Kael moved. He came to stand beside her. Not in front of her, not angled to block her, but beside her, at the same line. And the positioning was deliberate and specific, and she felt it in the same way she had felt everything about him since the corridor, precisely, with full awareness of what it meant. Lucien moved to her other side. Soltz looked at the 3 of them. He looked like a man standing at the edge of the only exit from a room that was on fire, measuring the drop. "I need," he started. "You need nothing," Kael said. His voice had the absolute zero-temperature quality she had heard through the locked door, but directed now at something external rather than at her, and the distinction was not small. "You need to understand that the column on that road is leaderless, and your proxy order is already being contested in the capital, and the only thing standing between you and a full imperial treason inquiry is the 3 people in front of you deciding it's more useful to have your testimony than your absence." Solz's jaw worked. "So you're going to tell us," Kael said, "where the 4th contingency is." A pause. "Because there is one," Kael said. "There's always one with you. And whatever it is, we need to know before it arrives." The courtyard waited, and Solce's face, for the first time in 4 years of existing in Seraphine's calculation as a fixed and immovable force, cracked. "The Emperor," he said. "He's not in the capital." No one moved. "He hasn't been in the capital for 6 weeks. Solka's voice had dropped to something almost inaudible. He's been at the Eastern residence. He's been ill, seriously ill. He looked at her. The council has known. Only the council. He paused. Which means the proxy order I'm carrying isn't a proxy order. She heard Kael's breathing change beside her. It's a forgery, Lucien said. Flat, certain, already running the implications. And if the Emperor is incapacitated, Seraphine said slowly, then the council isn't acting as proxy. She looked at Solte. They're acting as regents, she said, without authorization, which meant the Empire didn't have a war on its eastern plateau. The Empire had a coup. And Vanehold, with its 8 surviving horses and its 12 soldiers and its 3 people standing in a courtyard over the ruins of a political marriage, was the only place in the Empire where that information currently existed outside the walls of the Imperial Council chamber. A sound came from the approach road, different from before. Not the suspended stillness of a leaderless column. Movement, purposeful, reorganized movement, as if someone had taken command in Solse's absence. Someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Kael's hand found her arm. Not a grip. A contact. Specific and deliberate. 2 fingers against the inside of her wrist where the pulse was. Inside, he said. Now. She didn't move immediately. She looked at him. At his face in the cold morning light. At the cut on his arm. And the controlled damage in his eyes. And the particular quality of the 2 fingers against her wrist, which were not the fingers of a man managing a political asset. Seraphine. His voice had something in it she had never heard before, raw and direct and stripped of every layer of management he had ever applied to himself in her presence. Please. Outside the gate, the column was moving. She went inside. Not because he asked, because the calculation had completed itself in the 2 seconds between his hand on her wrist and the sound of the column reorganizing on the approach road. And the calculation said that dying in a courtyard over a principle that could be better defended from inside a fortified wall was not principled. It was wasteful. She had not come this far to be wasteful. Kael released her arm the moment they were through the inner gate. The contact ended cleanly, without the kind of lingering that would have made it something she needed to address immediately. And she noted this about him the way she had been noting things about him since the corridor, as information, carefully filed, not yet interpreted into conclusion. Lucien had Solse moved to the eastern holding room with 2 guards on the door and a 3rd outside the window, which was more security than a broken man in an advisor's robe strictly required, but was the correct call anyway. He came back to the war room, pulling off his riding gloves, and looked at the map, and then at both of them and said, 20 minutes before they reached the gate, tell me you have something. The forgery, Seraphine said. If we can establish the proxy order is forged before the column commander receives new orders, he has no legal authority to proceed. A commander who proceeds without legal authority in an imperial action faces personal liability under the military compact. You need a witness to the forgery, Kael said. He was at the table, standing, his right arm held slightly away from his body, at the angle of a man managing a wound that he has no current intention of acknowledging. Someone with direct knowledge of the Emperor's condition and location. Solke, Lucien said. Solche gives us testimony. We need corroboration. Kael looked at the map. His eyes moved to the eastern road, the southern approach, the ridge line. He was running something she couldn't see yet. The Emperor's personal physician, he'd be at the eastern residence. That's 2 days' ride, Lucien said. On a fast horse with a relay, 18 hours. Kael looked up. I know the physician. He was in my father's service before the Emperor retained him. He'll respond to a direct request from the Draven House if it reaches him before Solz's people can lock down the residence. Seraphine looked at him. You'd expose the Draven House's connection to the physician. That's intelligence you've held for years. Yes. You'd be burning it. Yes. He met her eyes. The quality of the eye contact was different from everything before it. Not the managed distance of the courtship weeks, not the raw damage of the receiving room. Something that had come through fire and was still standing on the other side of it. I'm burning it. She held his gaze for 1 more second. Then she looked at Lucien. Send your fastest rider. Lucien was already moving to the door. Go on. The column reached the gate 18 minutes later. The commander was a man named Castor Vell, a career imperial officer in his 50s who had the particular bearing of someone who had spent decades executing other people's orders and had developed, over that time, a highly refined instinct for when the orders he was being given were going to end his career. He stood at Vanehold's outer gate in his formal military overcoat, and he looked at the three people who came out to meet him, Seraphine, Kael, Lucien, in that order, and she watched his instinct fire immediately behind his eyes. She spoke first. She had written the opening statement in her head during the walk from the war room, and she delivered it, without notes and without hesitation, covering the proxy order's contestable legal status, the counter-documentation already filed with the imperial court recorder, and the specific provisions of the military compact that made proceeding without verified authorization a personal liability for the commanding officer. She spoke for 4 minutes. She spoke in the measured, precise cadence her father had taught her for rooms, where the wrong word at the wrong speed cost more than the situation could absorb. When she finished, Commander Vell was quiet for a long time. "I require verification of the counter-documentation," he said finally. "You'll have it within 24 hours from the court recorder's office," she said. "Imperial Post Protocol, which you can verify independently. An advisor Solk is in our custody and available for questioning under the terms of the Imperial Compact's detention provisions." She held his gaze. "Commander, I understand your position. You were given an order with full Imperial authorization markers on it, and you executed it in good faith. Nothing that has happened today is your error." She paused. "But proceeding against a fortified noble house on a potentially forged proxy order, with the legal challenge already in record, is a different calculation. That one is yours." Vell looked at the gate. He looked at the column behind him, 400 men in imperial colors on a plateau approach road, waiting. He looked at Kyle Draven. Looked at him for a specific moment, the look of a man taking a measurement. And whatever he measured, it appeared to meet some private threshold. "I'll hold position pending verification," he said. He turned and walked back to his column. Seraphine exhaled once, quietly, through her nose. She turned back toward the gate. Kyle was beside her, and Lucien was on her other side, and neither of them said anything. And the silence between the three of them had the specific quality of silence between people who have just moved through something together and have not yet sorted out what the moving through it means. The verification came in 22 hours. The Imperial Court Recorder confirmed receipt and registration of the counter-documentation. The physician's testimony arrived by relay rider 16 hours after that, confirming the Emperor's condition, his location, and the dates that made the proxy order's claimed authorization a physical impossibility. Solke, presented with the physician's testimony and the choice between cooperative witness and primary defendant, made the practical decision within the hour. Commander Vell withdrew his column on the third day. He did it quietly and without incident, which was its own kind of professional courtesy, and she noted it and would remember it later when the question of the Eastern Military Command restructuring came up, and she needed names she could work with. The thing about a coup that fails quietly is that its failure also has to be quiet. Loud failure requires loud response, and loud response draws the kind of imperial attention that consumes the people who drew it, regardless of which side they were on. She understood this. She managed the aftermath of Solce's confession with the same precision she had managed everything else, filing the testimony, sealing the proxy forgery evidence, writing the 3 additional letters that would need to reach specific people in the capital before the council's remaining faction could construct a counter-narrative. She did all of this in Vanehold's East Wing, at the writing desk, over 2 days. Kyle was in the stronghold throughout. He did not hover. He did not insert himself into her work. He appeared periodically in the doorway of the East Wing with food she had not asked for, which she ate without comment, and once with a physician to look at his arm, which she had asked about once and he had dismissed, and which turned out to be deeper than she had assessed from the courtyard. She sat with him while the physician worked. She did not hold his hand. She sat in the chair across from him and watched the physician work and said nothing, and he said nothing. And the silence between them was not the silence of the corridor or the carriage or the receiving room. It was different from all of those. It was the silence of 2 people who have run out of the versions of themselves they perform for other people and are sitting simply in the same room, breathing the same air. "It doesn't require an apology," she said, when the physician had gone. He looked at her. What you did on the wedding night, she said. I'm not asking you to apologize for it. I understand why you did it, and I understand that understanding it is not the same as accepting it, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. She held his gaze. But I'm not going to spend whatever comes next waiting for you to finish punishing yourself for it either. That's not useful to either of us. He was quiet for a long time. His arm was bandaged now, and he had his hand resting flat on his knee, and he was looking at her with the expression she had first seen in the receiving room when the composure had finally run out of resources to sustain itself. The fractured, rearranged expression of a man who was still learning to live in a face that no longer had its original architecture. I was afraid of you, he said. She waited. Not of you specifically. He stopped, started again. Of what you represented. The Vale Alliance was my father's last negotiation before he died. Every term of it was his, every condition. And when you arrived, you were... He paused. You weren't what I'd been told to expect. You weren't manageable in the way the arrangement had implied. And I didn't know what to do with that, so I did the worst possible thing I knew how to do. He looked at his hands. I made sure you understood you weren't wanted, before you could decide it yourself. The fire in the east wing hearth had burned down to coals. Outside, the plateau wind moved against the window glass with its constant impersonal pressure. She thought about the corridor, the locked door, the 2 words through the wood. She thought about how she had stood there and felt the floor of her life drop away, and how what had replaced it was not grief, but something colder and cleaner, and how that colder, cleaner thing had carried her out the front entrance and across the courtyard and into a black carriage and 4 days east and through an assassination attempt and a military column and a coup that had failed quietly on a plateau at the edge of the empire. She thought about what it meant that the fear had been his and not hers, or rather, that hers had looked like action and his had looked like cruelty, and how the difference between those 2 expressions of the same underlying terror had cost them both more than either of them had been prepared to pay. I know, she said. He looked up. I knew during the 2nd week of courtship. She held his gaze. I read people the way my father taught me to read people, which is the same way you read them. From the outside in, looking for what the surface is protecting. I saw the fear. I thought I could work around it. She paused. I was wrong about the timeline. Something moved through his face. Seraphine. I'm not saying it to wound you, she said. I'm saying it because we are going to have to go back to the capital and present a unified front to an imperial court that has just watched its council faction collapse. And if we walk into that court carrying unresolved damage between us, they will find it and use it. She let that settle. So, we resolve it. He was quiet. Then, how? By being honest about what it actually is. She leaned forward slightly. It isn't a marriage, not yet. It's an arrangement between 2 people who are very good at strategy and very bad at being seen by anyone they haven't already defeated. And the only reason we're still in the same room is that we've both run out of the option of not being seen. She held his gaze. That's a workable foundation. It's not a comfortable one. But I've never needed comfort. I've needed something that holds. Cale looked at her for a long time. She watched the thing that moved through his face, not the fracturing this time, not the collapse of composure into its constituent damage. Something different, something that was harder to name because it was forward-facing rather than backward-facing, the expression of a man who has finally turned away from the wreckage long enough to look at the horizon. I don't know how to do this, he said, whatever this is. Neither do I, she said. I was raised for the transaction, not for what comes after it. Then we're both starting from nothing. We're both starting from nothing, she agreed. With 6 years of combined intelligence on the Imperial Council's Eastern Proxy Network and a legally witnessed coup suppression on our record. She almost smiled. It felt less surprising than it had in the carriage. That's not nothing. That's considerable. He looked at her. And then, for the first time in 6 weeks of watching his face and reading its surfaces and cataloging its withdrawals, Cale Draven did something she had not predicted and had not accounted for and could not have prepared for. He smiled. Not performed, not managed, small and real and slightly crooked. The smile of a man who had forgotten for a long time that he was capable of it. She let herself look at it directly. Lucienne came to find her on the morning of the 5th day. She was on the northern parapet, watching the plateau in the early light, the cold air carrying the smell of distance and rock and the far-off suggestion of winter arriving from the northeast. He came to stand beside her, and they were quiet together for a while in the way they had been quiet in the carriage on the first night, before the crossbow bolt and the coup and the 3 days of maneuvering that had rebuilt the shape of everything. "You're going back to the capital," he said. "In 2 days. Kael's men need rest, and the horses need a day." She paused. "Will you come?" He was quiet for a moment. "No." She looked at him. "I have Eastern business that's been waiting for 3 weeks, he said. He was looking at the plateau, the flat expanse of it, the particular quality of space that belongs to places that have no interest in being anything other than what they are. "The capital doesn't need me in it right now. It needs the two of you, presenting the Soltse testimony and the proxy forgery and whatever political architecture you're going to build on the wreckage." He paused. 3 people walk into that court, it becomes a question about the Eastern Alliance. 2 people walk in, united, it becomes a statement. She looked at his profile. The angular stillness of it, the quality of attention directed outward at the plateau, the specific kind of privacy that belongs to people who have decided what they are not going to say and are comfortable with the decision. "You knew," she said. Not the same word she had used in the carriage, but the same structure. "On the night of the wedding, you knew this was where it would end up." He was quiet for a long moment. "I knew it was one of the possible endings." "Was it the one you wanted?" Another long pause, longer than the others. The plateau wind moved between them with its impersonal pressure. "I wanted you to be safe," he said, "and in a position to make your own choices." He turned to look at her. His eyes had that gray-green quality the torchlight had made difficult to read on the first night, and in the morning light she could read them clearly, and what she read was not hidden from her and was not offered cheaply and was not something she would pretend was a simpler thing than it was. "Those things happened, that's enough." She held his gaze. She thought about 4 days in a black carriage, the river at midnight, the 3 names that had matched, the way he had stood beside her at the gate and said nothing and been exactly the right kind of present. "Lucien," she said. "Don't," he said, quietly, without hardness. She nodded once. He turned back to the plateau. They stood together in the cold morning light for a while longer, and the silence between them was the most honest silence she had experienced in a life that had contained very few honest silences, and she let it be what it was without trying to resolve it into something more manageable. Chug. They left Vanehold on a gray morning with the winter smell strong in the air, and 12 of Kael's men and 4 of Lucien's who were riding west on separate business that happened to share the first 2 days of road. Seraphine was on horseback. She had found riding clothes in Vanehold's supply stores, the practical, dark, sized well enough with the belt adjusted. The wedding gown was folded in a saddlebag. She had not thrown it away. She had not put the Draven ring back on. Both of these facts existed in the same category of unresolved accounting that she intended to address when the capital business was behind them. Kael rode beside her. They had ridden in silence for an hour when he said, "Your father's going to have questions." "My father is going to have approximately 47 questions in a specific order of priority, and most of them are going to be about the Eastern Trade Compact, and 3 of them are going to be about my welfare, and 2 of them are going to be things he actually wants answers to." She looked at the western road ahead of them. "I'll handle my father." "I know you will." He paused. "I'd like to be present for it." She glanced at him. "Not to manage it," he said. "To be there." She looked at him for a moment. At the profile she had studied for 6 weeks from a strategic distance and was now studying from the distance of a horse's length, which was different in all the ways that mattered. The cut on his jaw from the night of the attack almost healed. The bandaged arm. The quality of his face in the gray morning light, which had lost the managed composure of the courtship weeks, and had not yet found whatever would replace it, but was operating in the interim with something rawer, and she thought more sustainable. "All right," she said. They rode west. The road back to the capital was 4 days, and she used 3 of them the way she used most sustained periods of movement, working, thinking, drafting letters in her head, and on paper when the road was smooth enough to write, reading the intelligence document Solse's testimony had unlocked, and building the case structure she would need when they walked into the imperial court. Kael was present for most of this. He read with her. He asked questions that were good questions, the kind that sharpened rather than complicated. And she answered them, and sometimes he answered hers, and the exchange had the quality of two people learning the specific shape of each other's minds with the cautious precision of people who have been badly surprised before and are not interested in being badly surprised again. On the fourth evening, they stopped at a way station 2 hours outside the capital. She was sitting at the way station table with the last of the documents when Kael came in from checking the horses and stood in the doorway and looked at her across the room with the specific quality of attention she had been learning to read. Not the strategic assessment, not the managed distance. The other thing. The thing that had first appeared in his face in the receiving room and had been present, in various forms, in every room since. "Put the documents down," he said. She looked up. "Just for tonight," he said. "They'll still be there in the morning." She looked at the documents. She looked at him. She thought about her father's house and the 20 years of training that had built her for exactly this kind of work. The capacity to stay functional and precise inside a life that kept trying to pull the floor out from under her. She thought about what it had cost her and what it had given her and what it could not give her and what that category of cannot had looked like over the last 6 weeks from a strategic distance. She put the documents down. He crossed the room and sat across from her, and they ate the way station's plain food and drank the rough wine and talked about things that had nothing to do with the Imperial Council or the proxy network or the Eastern trade routes. Small things, the kind of things that live in the gaps between the large things and are what the large things are ultimately protecting. She learned things about him she had not known and could not have learned from 6 weeks of strategic observation or her father's intelligence files or any of the architecture of the life they had each constructed to survive in. He learned things about her. It was late when she said, "You should know I'm not forgiving you because it's strategically useful." He was quiet. "I'm forgiving you because carrying it is heavier than not carrying it," she said. "And I've been carrying heavy things my entire life, and I'm capable of it, but I'm also capable of deciding when to set something down." She met his eyes. "This is me setting it down. That's what it is, and it's not more than that, and it's not less." He was quiet for a long time. The way station fire had burned low, and the room was darker than it had been, and outside the window, the road to the capital waited with its final 2 hours of distance. "I understand," he said. "Good." "Seraphine." He waited until she looked at him. "I'm going to spend a very long time earning the difference between what I owe you and what I want to give you. Those are different debts, and I understand they're both mine." His voice was level and direct and carried the specific quality of a man who had stopped performing himself. "I'm not asking you to wait for that. I'm telling you it's happening regardless." She looked at him across the low-lit table of a way station 2 hours outside the capital, in the plain clothes of someone who had packed practically for a journey that had turned out to be several different journeys layered on top of each other, with the Draven ring still in her pocket and the documents on the table between them and 4 days of hard road behind her and whatever came next ahead. She thought about the corridor, the locked door, the cold courtyard, the black carriage and the dark eastern road and the crossbow bolt in the door frame and the river she had not thrown the ring into and Lucian's face on the morning parapet and the plateau wind and Kael's 2 fingers against her wrist in the courtyard saying, "Please." She thought about what it meant to build something from nothing. Not the romantic version of that. She had no use for the romantic version. The real version. The version where nothing meant the rubble of everything that had already failed, and building meant choosing every day to put one piece on top of another in the specific knowledge that the last structure had fallen and the new one might fall too, and building it anyway because the alternative was standing in rubble indefinitely, and she had never been a person who stood still. "I know," she said. They left the way station in the gray pre-dawn and rode the last 2 hours to the capital through air that smelled of wood smoke and coming winter. And when the capital's gates appeared through the morning mist, she did not look back at the road they had come from. She looked forward. 1 year later, the Empire held its first full imperial court celebration in a decade that was not, underneath its surface, a performance of a power that had already changed hands in some back room. The council had been restructured. The Eastern Trade Compact had been renegotiated under terms that the Vale House and the Draven House had drafted jointly, with Lucien Vane's Eastern Passage interests written into the compact as a third protected party by a provision that had been Seraphine's idea and that her father had called, in his careful way, unexpectedly elegant. The great hall of the Imperial Palace was full. Cale stood at the hall's entrance in the Draven formal colors, and he looked across the room with the particular quality of attention she had learned over a year to read with a precision she had not had in the first 6 weeks. The attention that was not strategic assessment, not the management of distance, but the specific, unguarded focus of a man who had stopped performing himself some months ago and had not yet decided whether the person who remained was sufficient, but was living in that uncertainty without flinching. He was watching her. She was across the room, in conversation with her father and the new Eastern Trade Commissioner, wearing the deep blue of the Vale House because she had decided 6 months ago that the Draven colors were something she would choose when she chose them, and not before. And Kael had said nothing about this decision, and had not needed to because he understood it in the same way he was beginning to understand most of her decisions. From the inside, not the outside. She felt him watching. She finished the sentence she was saying to the commissioner and excused herself and crossed the room. He watched her come. She stopped in front of him. "The Vale Commissioner wants to discuss the Northern Access provision," she said. "I know, I read the brief. He's going to push for the extended term. I know, we're not giving it to him." "No," she agreed, "we're not." They stood together at the entrance of the great hall with the full imperial court moving around them. The noise of it, the politics of it, the vast, complicated machinery of a world that had nearly destroyed itself and was in the slow, unglamorous process of being rebuilt into something that might, given time and sustained pressure, and the specific kind of stubborn human determination that looked like stubbornness from the outside and felt like survival from the inside, hold. He held out his hand, not the way he had placed the ducal ring on her finger at the ceremony, the gesture of a man executing a transaction, his attention elsewhere. His hand, open, offered. The gesture of a man who understood exactly what he was asking. She looked at it. She thought about the ring in her pocket. Still there, still cold, still evidence of something she had not yet decided how to close. She thought about what it meant to choose rather than to be placed. What it meant to walk towards something rather than be arranged beside it. What it meant to understand the cost of a thing and pay it anyway. Not because the cost was small, but because the thing was worth it. And the worth was not romantic or abstract, but specific and earned and real in the way that only things you have bled for are real. She took his hand. They walked into the hall together, and behind them the entrance stood empty, and ahead of them the empire stretched out with all its irreducible difficulty and potential, and neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to say that the act of walking forward had not already said.